This is Building Lifestyles, a show designed to help everyday Australians create a lifestyle that inspires them using property development strategies. On the show, you'll hear from everyday people changing their lives doing property development. You'll learn from their successes as well as some of the challenges they've faced along the way. We also talk to experts from a range of fields who share specialised techniques that you can use to accelerate your property journey. I'm your host, Amanda McEwin, and I'm the founder of the Rising Star Developer, and I'm really passionate about helping everyday Australians build lifestyle using property development. Welcome to another episode of Building Lifestyles. Today we have an incredible guest who brings a wealth of knowledge in the negotiation space. Glin Bayley, also known as a value negotiator, has extensive experience with major organisations like Woolworths and Lendlease, where she's mastered the art of negotiating complex clauses such as liquidated damages, subcontractor agreements, and so much more. In this episode, Glin will share her expertise on how to negotiate win-win scenarios, a crucial skill set for developers, especially those in the small-scale property development space who want to build wealth and long-term success. If you're looking to improve your negotiation skills and learn how to turn deals into true value, you won't want to miss this. So make sure you get a notepad and start taking lots of notes. So let's get going. Welcome, Glin. I'm really looking forward to sharing with the listeners all your incredible skills around negotiation, which is such an important part of property development. So I've got so many good questions to ask that the listeners are going to get huge value out of. So let's get straight into it. You've negotiated with some of the biggest names in the industry like Woolworths and Lendlease. What was the most challenging negotiation you've been involved in, and how did you approach it?
Well, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to negotiation, first and foremost, is the recognition of what is a negotiation. And a negotiation in its most foundational form is a conversation between two or more parties in which you're trying to reach an agreement. So if I was to say, how many of those conversations are we having on a daily basis to reach an agreement? I would say all the time. And I think in terms of the challenging negotiations that we have, rather than picking one specific example, I think one of the most common areas where the teams that I train get stuck is the conversations that they're having either internally or with their negotiating partner externally, whether that be a supplier or a client. Now, in terms of the key distinction between what makes a conversation, a negotiation, or a regular conversation, it's the level of intention that you put into it. And I think one of the areas that I found most challenging for people is creating the time to recognize that in order to have a productive and valuable outcome in the negotiation, let's say at the table, you have to first set the table and you have to determine what deals available before you get at the table. And I think most people focus on negotiation as a skill set of when I'm opposite you and we're going to have this dialogue, what do I need to do? How do I need to say what I need to say and ensure what I say is not going to leave me exposed in any way, shape or form or exploited. But what people fail to realize is that they've already shed loads of value before they've even got to the table. So I think in terms of my own experience, if I think back to my UK time, I used to work in finance. And so I was first trained in negotiation skills with a UK business that was working with the UK retailers, so the likes of Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Asda, etc. The company that I was working for at the time was losing £52 million a year. So that's £1 million a week. That was just being lost in the business. And so when we were trained in negotiation skills, the focus was, well, how do you turn the ship around? And what are we trying to create in terms of value so that we don't keep destroying value? And in the bread business it was at the time, it's a commodity-based business, it's low margins. The retailers obviously need to make a margin to sell the product through. And as a manufacturer, the manufacturer needed to make a significant return on investment so that they can keep the plants operational and keep supporting. And so one of the biggest negotiations that I'd went through, and this was in my 20s, was around how do you get the sales, marketing, internal operation teams aligned with finance so that when we go into the retailers, our strategic approach internally is aligned. We know exactly what levers we have to pull, what we're willing to say yes to, what we're willing to say no to, but also what we think the retailers are going to do. How will they use our competitors as leverage against us in a way that will harm us or destroy value? So how do we ultimately stay ahead of what the interaction might be? And this level of negotiation was months of planning. It was months of dedicated support internally around the alignment, such that small details like when a retailer would come onto site, we knew who they were going to meet, exactly what route they were going to take, exactly what information that retailer would see on the whiteboards going down the corridor, what would be strategically placed, what would be strategically removed, who would be strategically in the corridor for a conversation and who wouldn't be, and how the business would be informed exactly who was on site when and what needed to happen. That is the level
Wow.
of thinking that's required if you want to be truly effective in negotiation. And we're talking multi-million pound deals at that point. And in the space of property that you are, there'll be multi-million dollar deals. So the level of thinking has to happen long before you're at a negotiation with a builder, a land, from a land acquisition perspective, from a subcontractor perspective, from a lender perspective, who you're borrowing money from, all of those different stakeholders that you might have in the picture. You need to think about what role they're playing and what level of influence they're going to have on the end outcome.
Gosh, there's so much more strategy than I'd even contemplated before. I think about all the negotiations that I've done over the years in having purchased, 30 or 40 different properties over the years. And I have my own mindset in terms of how I think I'm going to negotiate and all the strategy that goes behind the scenes in terms of understanding my numbers and understanding what the vendor wants and trying to understand their needs and always trying to get to a win-win situation. But it sounds like there's so much more that could be fine-tuned to achieve an outcome that's going to be mutually successful than I'd even thought about. So this is incredible.
Absolutely. And it's that time to think. And once you've identified the levers that are available within your industry, you're creating a list, if you like, a master schedule of all of the different variables that you've got to negotiate. And the more you give time to that, the more you can start to expand those list of variables that you negotiate over becomes, the list gets bigger. And the more the complex the negotiation in terms of the level of levers you have, ironically, people want to simplify it, but simplifying negotiation, simplifying the number of levers actually reduces your ability to create value. It ends up being more about distributing value and the less levers. So if the variable is predominantly price and there's only 2 or 3 other variables that you're negotiating, it's likely to be a competitive negotiation. Whereas where you've got more levers, more complexity, you can actually create more value because there's more opportunities to create value looking at different lenses through where the usefulness and benefit of what you are exchanging can be to various different parties. And I think without spending the time thinking up front as to what you need to consider, you lose all of that opportunity to create sort of almost like a master list of what's possible.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, you're right in terms of negotiation. Every element of life involves negotiation. I just think I was just negotiating with my 16-year-old to fold some washing before she goes out. So it's skills that are transferable to so many aspects of life. But in terms of the property side of things, I see so many different areas of negotiation. We have the first part of negotiation, which is actually securing the site. And then from behind the scenes as a developer, we're the ones that are doing the feasibility, making sure we're managing the risk and assessing that site to see if it's even worth putting that offer on to negotiate. So that's all the background work that we do is what I teach my students as well. And then you've got the actual physical offer that you make to the vendor in terms of what that's going to look like. So you have your own numbers there and you've got your walkaway price tucked away in your pocket, whether that's an auction or whether it's a private treaty. And then you've got all the conditions that you can put on the offer. And I know certainly one thing that I'm always about trying to create win-win situations, because I figure if someone else is getting taken advantage of, then that doesn't leave a great outcome. So I think there's always room to be able to negotiate back and forth and try and get to a middle ground where you're both happy and you walk away with a great outcome. That's always been my philosophy in negotiation. I'm sure there's lots of other elements I probably could incorporate into that, but with when it comes to property, I typically just try to understand what the vendor's terms of what they want, and then see how that overlays with what I'm wanting and what I'm trying to achieve with my project, and then meeting halfway. And because I guess in the property world, we have the real estate agent sitting in between that transaction. So, so it's always like Chinese whispers going between each side. You don't have that direct engagement with the end decision maker. So from your experience in negotiation, when you have a middle person like a real estate agent speaking between, being the mediator between two transactions, do you have much more influence in terms of how you can try and get a better outcome when you've got a middle person doing the negotiation for you, or doing not negotiation, but being the voice for you?
I think there's two elements. I'm just going to rewind back a little minute to give some context to the environment that you're in. So when it comes to negotiation, there's essentially two ways. There's multiple ways, but if we were to summarize it at the most simplest level, you've got collaborative value creation negotiation approaches, and you've got competitive value distribution negotiation strategies. The first thing is to identify what type of negotiation you're in, because if you don't know what type of negotiation you're in, then your strategy is going to not be clear and you may use the wrong strategy. So if you are in a competitive environment, the easiest way to tell whether that's a competitive distributive negotiation is to determine, is there opportunity to essentially grow the pie, or is the only opportunity to split it? So if, for example, it's a zero sum, it's predominantly price focused. So one party gets X many dollars, and if the other party negotiates better, they reduce the number of dollars that the other party gets and they win more. It's essentially becoming a win-lose strategy. And we need to understand that those exist, and you can still create a win-win, but it's not a true win-win in the sense of value creation. It's what you talk to is meet in the middle, concede. Basically, it's like each party is losing something of what they want to meet somewhere in the middle, right? Rather than actually a true win, where if value is created, you can create a true win because everyone's getting what they want, because there's different ways you can create value. But if you're in a simple, if I just use buying and selling a home, and I'll do it from a residential perspective because my brain can only keep things simple just for context, and you're buying and selling and you've got an agent in the middle, that transaction by nature is a one-time transaction, because I'm unlikely to be buying multiple residential homes for starters, and unlikely to be dealing with the same agent or seller again if I'm the one that's buying. So it's a one-time transaction. The most dominant variable in that transaction is price. So it becomes value distributive because other than price, like I might be able to put some conditions around, my finance period or conditions attached to the contract closing. But broadly speaking, the dollar value is what both parties are mostly interested in. So because it's the dominant variable, it's a distributive negotiation, which means if I get it at a lower price, the seller loses in that dollar value. And if they get it at a higher price, which is what the seller ultimately wants, I lose on that. Even if I'm happy to do the deal, in arbitrary terms, it's win-lose. So therefore, my approach, knowing it's a competitive negotiation because it's a one-time transaction, I don't need to have a relationship with either party post the deal being done. And it's predominantly price, and also the level of trust that I need between me and the intermediary, say the agent in the middle. I don't need to really trust the agent. I just need to trust him enough to be able to get the deal done, or her enough to get the deal done, right? So all of that is telling me low dependency, low trust, one single priority variable, one-time transaction. It's a competitive negotiation. And so even if I want to create a win-win, the intention really is, how am I splitting the pie? Because there's no opportunity to grow the pie here. I've just got to try and maximize the value that I can get, that the other party is willing to let me have. So when it comes to the intermediary, what you have to ask yourself is, whose interests are they likely to be serving? Because if it is a distributive negotiation, there is no true win-win. One party is going to get more of their interests met than the other party, and whose interests is the intermediary's interests most aligned with. So are they aligned with you as a buyer because helping you win more helps them win more? Or are their interests with the seller because helping the seller win more ultimately serves the agent in between? Because there is no creation of value in this situation, and one party will have greater leverage based on future interests that the intermediary may or may not get from one side or the other. So it's really understanding, where's the real influence, where might that intermediary be best having their interests met. And because it is a competitive negotiation, we can still be collaborative in the way we communicate. So we're not going to be, forgive my language, arseholes. And we're going to treat people respectfully, and we're going to treat people with a level of professionalism and care. But in that situation, the other party's interests are still secondary to us getting the maximum value that we want. So we have to recognize that's the context, because if we play a collaborative strategy in a one-time interaction, in a one-time opportunity, it's the wrong strategy for the wrong situation.
Yeah, okay. So given that most of our listeners are small-scale property developers, are there any key principles that they should be following when they're negotiating through an agent to get the best outcome?
So so I guess the first and foremost is, if that agent is representing their interests over the long term, so is it the same agent that they're likely to be dealing with in the first instance? Understanding that, because if it's a long-term relationship, you've got to build some level of connection around interests. What most people don't do first and foremost is gather the level of information necessary to understand what the true interests are, because the trust isn't established in the relationship. So first and foremost, if you've got a long-term party that's interested, before you even get to any negotiation, I would be having an information gathering session around, hey, this is what my business is about. I'd like to learn what your business is about. I've got an interest in buying and selling property, but I need to understand what's most important to you in any transaction from the type of business you're operating in, and can I share what's important to me? But that sharing has to be done with consideration that if I'm sharing information, I want to share high value information that's nothing related to the immediate negotiation that's coming up, because that forms a level of trust. Or I want to give low cost information that is directly related to any negotiation that I'm going to go into. But why I say low cost is the risk is low of you giving that information. And most people end up giving high value, high cost information directly to the other party, which means they've kind of declared their cards without assessing whether or not the other party was appropriately secure as a trusted party to share that information with. So my first interest is don't assume the intermediary's on your side. If you want to get information from them, be willing to give information. But when you give the information, you can give them something that's of high value to them, but may not be directly related to your negotiation. And an example might be, say, for example, you have a large network of people and you understand your intermediary's business, say a real estate agent businesses really well, and you understand what their growth trajectory requires, you might mention you've got a contact that is in the space that they're interested in, that you're very well connected with, or an opportunity for greater business that might pique their interest, which is great, but it's not directly linked to your negotiation. But it is high value for their listening to go, this person's of interest to me because they've got value they can bring to me, or not, albeit not directly related. But then the low cost information could be more information about what you're willing to negotiate on, the areas that are of low cost to share. So if I shared, what's not important to me is the particular access points for a site, or whatever else might be included in that. It's low cost because me telling you that is of no great consequence. But if I tell you something that requires a high level of trust and I don't have that, and the consequence of that information being shared is high, I wouldn't share it unless further trust has been established. So please, I guess is what I'm saying to your listeners, is don't assume just because you've got connection with someone that it's appropriate for you to share more information until the other party's demonstrated they're willing to reciprocate first. So it has to be this mutual reciprocation for a level of trust to be built on, not naive. I'm trying to be collaborative, so I'm going to share everything and then be surprised if you don't honor what I'm actually looking for.
And I guess another example that I see with that is in terms of the longer term value, when you're working with an agent that you may use for repeated business, if they understand that you're a developer, they're not going to necessarily see you as one transaction. They might say, okay, well, there might be more opportunities down the track because you're going to be doing more projects and that's more opportunity for them. So I see that as a good example. And I've had examples on the flip side as well, where I may have purchased from an agent and then they will assume to get the business, but then there's been no contact, no relationship building whatsoever. I haven't even checked in to see if there's what I'm designing, and then the expectation that they're going to get the listing at the end. And it's like, well, hang on a second, you haven't even added any value whatsoever. So you can certainly see that works on both sides of the fence.
And I think part of that is your priming has to be accurate. So upfront, your positioning and your priming, so that you're dangling the opportunity in front of them, but it's conditional, right? So, hey, I'm open. I'm a developer that has a portfolio of different opportunities here that I could give you the opportunity to sell. However, we only partner with people that demonstrate their value up front, because this pipeline is worth X much, So if you can paint a picture of the potential pipeline value that they've got, you want someone that's willing to jump through hoops to demonstrate they're worthy of that opportunity. And the only time that they're going to be willing to do that is whilst you've still got leverage. If you promise them that without making them do anything in advance, then you've lost leverage. You might have got a little small win there, but the potential upside would have been far greater if you'd got them to show their commitment to your value system upfront, because the long game is a collaborative game. It's not a competitive game. And the long game is very much about having people show you who they are, not tell you who they are.
Yeah, no, so true. And that's when you align yourself with people with similar values and you have that value-driven conversation, it certainly leads to a lot longer term relationships. That's for sure. I've certainly found that in my business. Just moving on probably so the biggest, in terms of developers, probably I see there's the negotiations throughout the whole transaction. Certainly the first one is, or not necessarily the first one of them is buying the property. Another really big transaction or negotiation area I see is where we're using money partners. So if we're going to be using other people's money in the forms of investors or joint venture partners, there's a lot of the conversations around negotiation that happen with that. So whether that's me bringing an opportunity to a potential money partner and they might be providing equity or debt, there's certainly a big negotiation that's involved in that, trying to understand what their needs are, what they want to contribute and what they're going to do versus what I'm going to do, and how you're going to split the profits, and all those conversations that take place. I see that as being a really big negotiation. And in that case, always trying to make sure that we can find that win-win. And yes, and sometimes there might be that balance might be misaligned. And one thing that I certainly, when I speak to my members, it's like, okay, well, sometimes that balance might have to tip in order to be able to get the deal across the line, because otherwise you might not have a deal at all. So I guess you see that win-win certainly balancing. But when it comes to doing negotiations, when it comes to dealing with money in transactions, especially if it's a joint venture arrangement, are there any other things that we should be thinking about from a negotiation perspective to try and get a great outcome? And I'm not sure what sort of negotiation that would actually swing towards.
Well, they're all part of the same, right? In terms of you having a conversation which to reach an agreement, right? So if I was to give an example of a situation that I wasn't part of, but is as an example of, I guess, a real estate one, where you've got a developer wanting to purchase a block of properties that are, this is in the US, that are currently apartments. But if you were to redevelop them into condominiums, they'd be worth significantly more in terms of value. However, the issue, and these apartments are, say, rented out by the individuals involved. However, the person that owns the current apartment block has tried to get the rezoning done with the local council. And the council's like, no, we can't rezone it. So therefore, even though the opportunity is there, you've got, say, a third party interest, whether it's the money person or whether it's the council, whether it's the government around what's possible. You've got different people involved at multiple stages, right? So in this example, what happened was the potential for the developer was huge, but the blockage was the council won't rezone, so we can't unlock the value that's potentially available in this development opportunity. But let's see what's possible. So they made an offer to the purchaser based on the fact that it was selling a lot lower because they couldn't get the rezoning done. And in that example, they agreed a period of time. I can't remember exactly how many days, was I think a 90-day sort of for the money has to land. And in that example, it's like, okay, we'll commit to that. We'll give you 90 days for all of the settlement. In that time, they contacted all of the individual owners, and say those apartments on their own were worth, say, $25,000. If they were rezoned to and made into condominiums, they'd be worth $75,000. So what they offered was the opportunity for renters to own their own property by paying $50,000 and say, well, you, instead of being a rentor, you can be an owner, and we'll offer it you at $50,000, which is $25,000 less than the market value of what a condominium in that location would be. So not only do you become an asset owner, but you also have equity in your property because we're willing to sell it to you lower. And you're thinking, well, why are they doing that? Because they're taking 25 grand off their individual margin for each block. But the issue is they haven't got the zoning approved. So what they did was influence all of the individual renters to say, we want you to become owners. We want you to become safe in your own home. We can arrange finance for you to have approval to pay essentially $50,000 over 25 years. You don't even have to pay a deposit. If someone made you that offer, would you be interested? Now, of course, all of the renters in that apartment block are going to go, yeah, amazing. Of course, I get to own my own property, don't need to pay a deposit. I get 25 grand's worth of equity in the bank, and I pay it over 25 years, which is less than my rent cost now. Go to a council meeting. The condition was they had to come along to the council meeting. Go to the council meeting for the rezoning, and the opportunity for the council, if they rezoned it, was they would make a higher level of tax for the building as a condominium versus an apartment. They get 40 of their potential owners speaking for the yes to rezone. So now the council's sitting there going, well, we weren't going to rezone it, but all of the tenants are going, yes, we want this rezoned because it gives us a chance to own our own property. The council wins because the rezoning gives them more tax, and the developer wins because now they've been able to elevate the value of the property, which the council rezoned. So the value of the property instantly went up, which meant the bank was able to lend them money in advance of what they had to pay the owner for the current owner for the property, all within a 90-day period.
Wow.
And I look at that and go, that's the ultimate example of a negotiation where you've got multiple parties involved, the money people, in this case, a bank, and also the owner that was selling it, the potential tenants of the property, and the government involved in any rezoning. But the way it's done and the order in which it's done and who's influenced at what point ultimately determines the win. So, the owner won because they got a deal that they were happy to sell on. The developer definitely won because they got a building rezoned and got way more value. The owners won because they were renters and became asset owners, and the council won because they made more tax. That is an example of a win, 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 win,
Yeah,
all the way through. So you have to think broader. So rather than, tactics and tips, it's a really strategic way of thinking around, how big are these developments? How much money is involved here? Who's got interests that are not the obvious, but beyond the obvious? And the only way you can do that is if you're gathering information, analyzing the data that you're getting from multiple sources as to what's really important to people and speaking to their intrinsic need rather than what's externally shown on the surface.
Yeah, that's an amazing example. What an incredible deal that they created as well in the process.
Yeah.
An example of strategy. What do you suggest in a situation where the negotiation's not going in your favour? So, for example, I've got plans in council. Council are being really strict and not negotiating in any way, and you're limited in terms of what you can and can't do. Are there any strategies that we should be thinking about? And that's when you're on the back foot on a negotiation. Are there strategies or tools that you can use to try and either open negotiation or turn it around?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I'd say is, again, part of that planning, that shouldn't come as a surprise, right? So if someone's doing negotiation well, that's an example of getting to the table and finding the other party doesn't want to play, right? Whereas if you plan in advance and go, who in council would this need to go to? And what are their levels of interest and what's their underlying mission? Like, they might represent the council, but they might have their own agenda. And if you don't know their agenda, you can't anticipate and you can't lay the steps in advance to be able to influence the right people. So that's one thing. But if you do find yourself in a situation where you're already there, the key thing is to focus on where there is alignment. So if there is an interest and say this is where the party's at least talking to you and they might not be ready to approve, but you want to go, under what conditions would this be a development that would be willing to be approved? And if they say under no conditions whatsoever, like, okay, so let's put my development aside, my interest to one side. What's the actual objective of your role and in the context of what the council's trying to achieve, and how can I best support that in the future so that I best understand what you're going to need me to come to the table with? Because at this point, what you've done is diffuse pressure, because if you still keep going on about your position right now and what you need, you're never going to get the other party to open up. So you have to put it to one side and go, okay, let me just put that to one side. Let me understand your future vision and what would I need to bring next time. However, you're diffusing pressure, but once they start sharing, you can build a level of trust and you can bring that conversation back to the table and go, okay, if I was to relate it to my current context, what you're saying is if we did this, this, and this, there may be an opportunity. Is that correct? Whereas we're too busy creating positions and we're entrenching ourselves on either side of the table. And what we've got to do is maneuver ourselves so that we're sitting next to the party that we're actually negotiating with, metaphorically or physically, and getting them to see that we're actually a comrade, not a competitor. And I think the more we can start viewing people as comrades, the way we think would be different, because we'd be thinking, okay, well, they're a comrade, but they don't seem to be supporting what we're doing. what is it that they're not seeing that we need to help them to see, or what is it we're not seeing that they can help us see differently. I would never get entrenched in data. So one of the areas for frustration often is, and I see this a lot around price and data, what something's worth, whether in your case it's square meterage, cost per square meterage, what the market value is, what's, someone's data set is. Each party will have data that will support their position. So if you're a seller, your objective is to get the maximum price. If you're the buyer, your objective is to get the minimum price that you have to pay. So our data is going to support our objectives. If people start talking and negotiating over, well, my data says this and my data says that, well, you're never going to reach an aligned agreement because you're not paid to agree with each other. You're actually representing different interests. What you need to do is put the data to one side and talk to the objective of the overall deal and say, okay, is the interest of the deal still aligned? What's the spirit of the agreement you're trying to reach? And if you can speak to the spirit of the agreement, you can find a pathway from that. But most people stick with the detail and don't chunk their way up to the spirit of the agreement, which means egos get in the way. People's call it the chimp gets out of the cage, and then suddenly you're not talking to two humans, you've got two monkeys pitching their own interests and not listening to each other. So that's a short way of, I guess, a short answer to a very long situational context, if you like, because whilst these questions are great, Amanda, if I was to just give you tactical stuff, it would be remiss, because negotiation works in considering the whole context, not just here's a minor twist, because the knock-on implication of each change could be huge.
Yeah, and I love the analogy about the two chimps or the two monkeys, that you see that happen time and time and again. And I also love how you're opening all of our minds to negotiation being so much more than tactical. There's just so much strategy that's involved, and if you get the strategy right, then the tactics should be
just so much easier, because you're playing a very different game to how most people are playing the game. Like, traditionally it's like it's bartering type negotiation, it's hard bargaining. That's not sophisticated negotiation, that's just tactical. But if you start playing a different game, you can control the chessboard essentially before someone's even sat at the table to play the game with you. And I think that's what I'd encourage your people to start thinking about, is what parts of this chessboard am I not laying out strategically in advance, and where am I over indexing on doing the negotiation in the moment rather than the strategic planning of who's who in the zoo, who would I need to influence? Because even as something as simple as reverse mapping from your key stakeholders, if someone in council is going to approve it, like, who's that person? And then who do they listen to? And then who do they listen to? Because I'd be starting with the outside ring of people that are advisors to the main decision maker, because everyone's got someone's ear. Your objective is to find out who's got whose ear and who's got the greatest level of influence to ensure that listening is ready. So in my old background as a finance executive, I just knew if you wanted the CEO to approve something, they'd turn to the CFO and go, right, what does my CFO think of this, or their trusted partner? The CFO would have their right-hand person who they trust, and then they would have people that would provide them insights and data. And so you can control a narrative a long way down the chain if you've thought about who's going to be told the story and in what order you want that story to reach them.
Yeah, how amazing. That sounds incredible. So in terms of, what do you see as the common mistakes that people make in negotiation?
I think not realizing how much you leak value through the language you use. So I see it in every single negotiation workshop where when people are making offers, their language is really loose, it's soft, and the loose language leaks value. So making offers like probably, I'm looking for, around about, like, we use terms that are there to soften our own discomfort in making a proposal. But in softening our own discomfort, our language becomes a lot looser because we're trying to soothe ourselves in the process of making an uncomfortable offer. And so that loose language comes out, and people, if you're trained, you're listening for that. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's loose. They're either, they're uncomfortable here, or they've got room to maneuver here. They've got opportunity to move on this. And so the listening gives a lot of information if you're clued into hearing for the words that leak value. The other thing I would say in terms of the mistake is entrenching yourself in your own position and not spending enough time stepping into the shoes of the other party. And for me, that's not something you just do from an empathetic perspective, or let me understand your position. You've got to do it from a strategic understanding of where your potential objections are going to be. Now, often if we don't do that, we don't consider the objections. And then when the other party raise them as objections, guess what? They are objections because they've raised them. However, if you've already thought about what their objections are going to be, if you raise them, guess what? They're no longer objections. They're now conversation topics. So that planning, that foresight into what might an objection be, and if I label it first, then we can have a conversation around it. Whereas if I leave it to them to label because I didn't even think about it, now I'm trying to sell myself and justify myself and justify my position, which actually puts me at a much greater disadvantage. It's a much weaker position for you to be in if you're having to justify than if you're priming and positioning up front.
Yeah, okay, that's certainly opened my mind. I think back to some of my negotiations and going, yep, I might have done that. Yes, I might have done that. So I'm getting so much gold out of this. Finally, in terms of if you could give our listeners one piece of advice to improve their negotiation skills, what would it be?
Be intentional. I think, one, take the time to plan. Everyone says they're busy. We are busy. We're all in this world of instant gratification. So we want this immediate result. We want an immediate outcome. But I would say if you plan up front and are more strategic in your thinking, everything that flows downstream from that is significantly easier. And it allows you to be more present in the room with the party you're negotiating with, to listen for their language, to notice their body language, to notice where the opportunity is, because you're not in your world thinking about, well, what do I need to say next? And how am I going to do this? It's like you've done all of that. And now you're in the performance, you're ready to go. So it's game day. Whereas most people turn up to game day never having done any practice. So I'm like, treat yourself like an athlete, do the practice, have your rehearsal days, have your practice days, do the strategic planning days, and then turn up to game day with your best performance. And I think that's, if you do one thing, make the cycle longer so that you actually close the time in which you negotiate, because the time to close a deal would be much faster than it would be if you don't do the planning up front.
Wow, amazing tip. And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of so much of this, which is
lots.
Yeah, I can imagine given what you do. But thank you so much for sharing just a bit of an insight in terms of helping us to think differently when it comes to the whole negotiation conversation. And I think certainly for myself, it's made me think, okay, I could be doing things so much better. So thank you for opening our minds and sharing your insight and your wealth of knowledge as well.
And check that out.
Yeah, a negotiation playbook, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is we'll put that into the show notes as well. So it sounds like if you want to know more about negotiation, definitely check out the negotiation playbook, and it's something that we can all improve on. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your time. And
you're most welcome.
In that book.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Lovely to speak with you.
Likewise. Bye for now. Thank you so much for listening. This is Building Lifestyles, a show designed to help everyday Australians create a lifestyle that inspires them using property development strategies. This podcast was produced by the Rising Star Developer. We've been helping Australians realise their financial and lifestyle goals since 2020. We play a pivotal role in educating, supporting and celebrating the goals and successes of our students and our community. To find out how we can help you realise your property, wealth and lifestyle goals, head to our website www.risingstardevs.com. www.risingstardeveloper.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Building Lifestyles, be sure to subscribe to and follow the show in your favourite podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review as it really helps others find the show. I'm Amanda McEwin, and we'll be back next episode with more tips on how you can build your lifestyle.